Hi, it's Zeke with the Eastside Church of Christ in Baytown, Texas. Thanks for joining us as we continue our study in 1 Samuel. This week we're going to be in chapters 21 and 22 as we look at David's life on the run. The last thing we read about David was he and his deep friendship with his friend Jonathan, Saul the king's son. At the end of chapter 20, it says that David arose and departed while Jonathan went into the city. David departed to begin a life as an outlaw, a life on the run. David's worst fears are confirmed. Saul, the king, indeed wants him dead, and now his friend Jonathan knows that it's true. And so David has no option but to flee from Saul or be killed. And don't forget that David is still a relatively young man. He's probably somewhere in his mid-20s. And the following 9 chapters of 1 Samuel chronicle David's life on the run from Saul until finally Saul and his son Jonathan die in battle and David is made king before all Israel, but that's still some years away. Now we find David on the run, and the first place that we find that he comes to is a place called Nob. In chapter 21, let's read verses 1 through 9. It said, "Then David came to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest, and Ahimelech came trembling to meet him, and said to him, 'Why are you alone, and no one with you?'" Now, we'll stop there for just a moment. Nob is a city not very far from King Saul's headquarters in Gibeah. And it seems to have taken the place of the worship center that was once at Shiloh. Shiloh had probably been destroyed by the great Philistine conflict that we saw back in the early chapters of 1 Samuel. And so David had fled from Ramah, where he had gone to see Samuel, had probably visited with Jonathan near Gibeah, and now had gone down to Nob. Now, Ahimelech was the grandson of Phinehas, one of Eli's corrupt sons. And this could have been the reason both he and David seem unsure whether to trust the other. Don't forget, Samuel had foretold that Eli's lineage was not going to remain in the priesthood. But for now, Ahimelech is serving as priest. Let's continue reading. In 1 Samuel 21, beginning in verse 2, we're continuing in verse 2, it says, "David said to Ahimelech the priest, 'The king has commissioned me with a matter, and has said to me, let no one know anything about the matter on which I am sending you, and with which I have commissioned you. And I have directed the young man to a certain place. Now therefore, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread, or whatever can be found.' The priest answered David and said, 'There is no ordinary bread on hand, but there is consecrated bread, if only the young men have kept themselves from women.' David answered the priest and said, 'Surely women have been kept from us as previously when I set out, and the vessels of the young men are holy, though it was an ordinary journey. How much more then today will their vessels be holy?' So the priest gave him consecrated bread, for there was no bread there, but the bread of the presence, which was removed from before Yahweh in order to put hot bread in its place when it was taken away. Now, one of the servants of Saul was there that day, detained before Yahweh, and his name was Doeg, the Edomite, the chief of Saul's shepherds. David said to Ahimelech, 'Now was there not a spear or a sword on hand? For I brought neither my sword nor my weapons with me, because the king's matter was urgent.' Then the priest said, 'The sword of Goliath, the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, behold, it is wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. And if you would take it for yourself, then take it, for there is no other except it here.' And David said, 'There's none like it. Give it to me.'" Okay. First we find that David makes a request. David needs food, but all that there is consecrated bread. Ahimelech says there's no ordinary bread, but there's consecrated bread. This is the bread that was put out on a table and was replenished every certain number of days before God. And it was only for the priest to eat when it was taken away. Now, normally probably there would have been plenty of food since the priests were to be well taken care of, but this is apparently a time of spiritual decline, and maybe the people weren't doing as they should or tithing as they ought to, and maybe the spiritual decline is also reflected in the fact that one of Eli's lineage is now serving as apparently high priest. All that's available is this consecrated bread. So how could Ahimelech give David the bread which was only to be eaten by priests? Well, maybe the answer is given to us in chapter 22. In chapter 22, when this Doeg the Edomite reports what he saw, he says concerning Ahimelech in verse 10, he inquired of the Lord for him, gave him provisions, and gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine. So it seems that Doeg, as an eyewitness, saw Ahimelech the priest ask God if he should give David this bread. And apparently the answer from God is yes, he was authorized to go ahead and do that. In any case, this very event is cited by Jesus as an excusable violation of regulation. Jesus talks about it in Matthew chapter 12, in Mark chapter 2, and in Luke chapter 6. David needs food, and so he receives this consecrated bread. But David also needs weapons, and all that's available is Goliath's sword. Now think about this for a moment. This must have certainly aroused even more suspicion on the part of Ahimelech. David was one of Saul's prized generals, his fighting man. Why would he be out on a mission for Saul without any weapons? Well, David says, well, I had to leave in a hurry. And so Ahimelech tells him, well, all that's here is Goliath's sword, the very sword that David used to kill that big man back in 1 Samuel chapter 17. And the place where it was stored seems to indicate that it was an honorable thing. It was a relic that they prized. It was stored behind the ephod, it says. And of course David is glad to have it. He says, there's none like it. Give it to me. And so he takes it. But did you notice that David is noticed? It tells us that Doeg the Edomite saw David. Now, it tells us that this Edomite, this non-Israelite, was there at this worship center. Why he's there, we don't know. It tells us that he was detained before the Lord in verse 7. And why he was detained before God, we don't know that either. But we do know that he was the chief of Saul's shepherds. He's obviously high up in Saul's hierarchy or power structure. He's the chief of all of Saul's livestock. And this non-Israelite, in fact, we're told he's an Edomite, not just here, but also 3 more times in chapter 22. He is going to have a key role in basically snitching out David. He notices David, and he's going to be more than willing to give this information to Saul later on. Well, from Nob, David heads on to Gath. Let's read together. In 1 Samuel 21 and verse 10, it says, Then David arose and fled that day from Saul and went to Achish, king of Gath. But the servants of Achish said to him, Is this not David, the king of the land? Did they not sing of this one as they danced, saying, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s? David took these words to heart and greatly feared Achish, king of Gath. So he disguised his sanity before them and acted insanely in their hands and scribbled on the doors of the gate and let his saliva run down into his beard. Then Achish said to his servants, Behold, you see the man behaving as a madman. Why do you bring him to me? Do I lack madmen that you have brought this one to act the madman in my presence? Shall this one come into my house? All right. let's just notice, first of all, where Gath is. David leaves Nob, which is, of course, in Israelite territory, and heads over into Philistine territory, enemy territory, some 20 miles away to a Philistine city, an enemy city. And apparently his reputation precedes him. Because even there, people have heard the song that made Saul so angry. Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. Plus, don't forget, David has the sword of their champion, their dead champion, in his possession. But I want you to notice, it says that he fled in fear of Saul. David was in fear of Saul, and that's the reason why he had fled to non-Israelite territory, to Philistine territory. But even there, it tells us that he's in fear of Achish. And so he fakes insanity. In verse 13, it says, he disguised his sanity before them and acted insanely in their hands, and scribbled on the doors of the gate and let his saliva run down into his beard. David is doing everything he can to act nuts, to look crazy before these people, to kind of let their guard down. And convinced, apparently he's very convincing in his ruse. And he takes the edge of suspicion off, apparently, the concerned Achish. Because Achish is not worried about him. In fact, what he's saying is, I've got enough crazy people. Do you need to bring another one to me? And it seems as though David was seized by the Philistine men and brought before Achish. And Psalms 34 and 56 seem to come from this experience. In fact, Psalm 56 was David's prayer for help. I'm going to turn there. Psalm 56. If you look at the superscription of Psalm 56, it says that it was written by David when the Philistines seized him in Gath. So apparently he was taken forcibly before King Achish. And the emphasis here is on the slander and the verbal attacks that David had to endure by the Philistines as they tried to get their king to deal with David. And there's no question that David was in fear. You read some of this psalm. In verse 3, he says, when I am afraid, I will put my trust in you. And that's exactly what David did. In verse 4, David says, in God whose word I praise, in God I have put my trust. I shall not be afraid. What can man do to me? In fact, that the end of verse 4 is the very advice that the Hebrew writer gave to New Testament Christians when they wrestled with persecution. That's in Hebrews chapter 13 and in verse 6. But Psalm 34 indicates to us the praying that David did. Let's turn there. Psalm 34. Psalm 34, the superscription here is talking about when David feigned madness before the Philistine king who drove him away, and he departed. It seems that David realizes that if there's going to be any kind of help, it's going to have to come from God. He's not going to be able to lash out in retaliation. He's going to have to take a higher road. And in fact, if you look at Psalm 34, in verse 11, David says, come, you children, listen to me. I will teach you the fear of the Lord. Who is the man who desires life and loves length of days that he may see good? Keep your tongue from evil. Keep your lips from speaking deceit. Depart from evil and do good. Seek peace and pursue it. The eyes of the Lord are toward the righteous, and his ears are open to their cry. The face of the Lord is against evildoers, to cut off the memory of them from the earth. The righteous cry, and the Lord hears and delivers them out of all their troubles. The Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves those who were crushed in spirit. Peter the Apostle takes verses 12 through 16 and he offers them his advice in his first letter, 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 10 through 12, for those who are tempted to lash out in retaliation against those who are giving them difficulty. They're suffering for Christ. And so Peter offers these same verses and says we can do what David did. We can take a higher, more noble road. But don't forget, as we go back to 1 Samuel chapter 21, that David is on the run from Saul. Not only that, but he's also suspected by the Philistines. So now, where can David go? Well, chapter 22 finds David still on the move. And he goes from Gath to a place called the cave of Adullam. Let's read. 1 Samuel 22 and verse 1. So David departed from there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. And when his brothers and all his father's household heard of it, they went down there to him. Everyone who was in distress and everyone who was in debt, everyone who was discontented gathered to him, and he became captain over them. Now there were about 400 men with him. And David went from there to Mizpah of Moab. And he said to the king of Moab, Please let my father and my mother come and stay with you until I know what God will do for me. Then he left them with the king of Moab, and they stayed with him all the time that David was in the stronghold. The prophet Gad said to David, Do not stay in the stronghold. Depart, and go into the land of Judah. So David departed and went into the forest of Hereth. And we'll stop there. David had moved back into Israelite territory, at least. He went from Philistine territory, city of Gath, to this cave of Adullam. And it says that David was joined by his family. Why? Well, by now, David's falling out of favor with Saul may have been well known, and his family may have feared retaliation by Saul. And it tells us further that David was not only joined by his family, but he was also joined by everyone who was in distress. In fact, if you read that again, look at the description it gives of those who joined David. In verse 2 of chapter 22, everyone who was in distress, everyone who was in debt, everyone who was discontented gathered to him, and he became captain over them, and now there were about 400 men with him. That's a lot of people who were bummed out. That's a lot of people who were in distress. And the description really echo the effect of poor leadership. Poor leadership fosters discontentment. It fosters discouragement. It fosters distress. And so they rally around someone who they believe is a kindred leader, because David himself was discontented. David himself was in distress. And so they find a kindred spirit. And not only does David's family join him, David now has the opportunity to raise an army, a small one for now, but it's people who see him as the leader that he is. And Psalms 57 and 142 seem to come from this time in David's life when he was in that cave. In fact, the superscription says that it was when David was in the cave. And both those Psalms, Psalm 57 and 142, they both emphasize, again, David's fear while he relies on his faith in God. Now, we read that from there, David went into Moabite territory. Again, he goes into foreign territory, and he asks protection there for his parents. Now, think about this. Why ask this of Moabites? The law restricted Moabite contact and was very explicit about that contact in Deuteronomy chapter 23, verses 3 through 6. But don't forget, David's great-grandmother, Ruth, was a Moabitess. And maybe some folks in Moab knew that. And so David thought he could ask this of them. But David is instructed by Gad, the prophet, to leave Moab and go back to Judah. So there's another question. Who's Gad? Well, I don't know. There's no info that's given concerning Gad, except a lost document that's known as the Chronicles of Gad that's connected to him in 1 Chronicles chapter 29. But here, Gad's wording is strong. Verse 5, Gad tells David, "Do not stay in the stronghold. Depart and go into the land of Judah." Now, perhaps Gad had given David this exhortation to go back into Judah for a very simple reason. The law, don't forget, prohibited the establishment of friendly treaties with the Moabites. And as a true prophet of God, Gad's duty was to help others understand that law. And if David established such a treaty with the king of Moab, he would violate the law and so risk bringing judgment on himself and also those who were with him. Don't forget now, David has a sizable following, and they're looking to him not only for answers, but for leadership as well. Well, David, as he is on the move, his contact with the priests at Nob comes to Saul's ears, and Saul does a horrible thing. In 1 Samuel 22, as we continue from verse 6, it says, "Then Saul heard that David and the men who were with him had been discovered. Now Saul was sitting in Gibeah, under the tamarisk tree on the height with his spear in his hand, and all his servants were standing around him. Saul said to his servants who stood around him, 'Hear now, O Benjamites, will the son of Jesse also give to all of you fields and vineyards? Will he make all of you commanders of thousands and commanders of 100s?'" So think what's going on here. Saul is taking this place of judgment under the tree, and he's letting everybody who listen know that David is not the leader that they think they want. He's really the leader that they need, but Saul doesn't want them to have him. And so he says, is David going to give you all the things that I give you? Is David going to help you? Is David going to give you fields and vineyards and put you in high positions? Of course, the answer implied by all that is no, Saul, you're the one who's going to do all this good stuff for us, right? Well, as we continue in verse 8, Saul's suspicions become wild. He says, "For all of you have conspired against me so that there is no one who discloses it to me when my son makes a covenant with the son of Jesse. And there is none of you who is sorry for me or discloses it to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in ambush as it is this day." Now think about what's going on here. We see where Saul's suspicions are as wild and wide-ranging as ever. He suspects conspiracy in all of his closest advisors, and his accusations become unreasonable. He says, "None of you let me know when my own son betrays me." But there is somebody who's willing to give him information. Verse 9 says, "Then Doeg the Edomite," and at least twice more in this chapter, it's going to remind us that Doeg is an Edomite. "He was standing by the servants of Saul, and he said, 'I saw the son of Jesse coming to Nob, to Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub. And he inquired of the Lord for him, gave him provisions, and gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine.' Then the king sent someone to summon Ahimelech the priest, the son of Ahitub, and all his father's household, the priests who were in Nob, and all of them came to the king. Saul said, 'Listen now, son of Ahitub.' And he answered, 'Here I am, my lord.' Saul then said to him, 'Why have you and the son of Jesse conspired against me, in that you have given him bread and a sword, and have inquired of God for him, so that he would rise up against me by lying in ambush, as it is this day?' Then Ahimelech answered the king and said, 'And who among all your servants is as faithful as David, even the king's son-in-law, who is captain over your guard and is honored in your house? Did I just begin to inquire of God for him today? Far be it from me. Do not let the king impute anything to his servant or to the household of my father, for your servants know nothing at all of this whole affair.'" Now we'll stop there for just a moment. Saul's suspicions, as we said before, are wide-ranging. And without proof, he begins to accuse those who were closest to him. And Saul's trust is as self-serving as ever. He's not willing to listen to fellow Israelites. Instead, he listens to Doeg, a foreigner, who is more than ready to throw Ahimelech the priest under the bus, or under the camel as it were. And that's all the justification that Saul needs to drag the priest and the other priests before him. Now, of course, Saul isn't concerned about explanations. He wants a scapegoat to punish, and he finds one in Ahimelech in spite of the priest's reasonable explanation. Ahimelech gave a four-pronged defense or response to Saul. First, he provided a fivefold defense of David. Far from being Saul's enemy, David was 1, your servant, 2, faithful, 3, the king's son-in-law, 4, the captain of your bodyguard, Saul, and 5, honored in your household. Second, Ahimelech characterized the priestly actions towards David as routine. In fact, when you look at verse 15, Ahimelech asks, "Did I just begin to inquire of God for him today?" In other words, this isn't the first time I've done this before. So it wasn't unusual for me to do what he asked of me. And third, the priest affirmed his loyalty to Saul, calling himself your servant. In fact, if you look further on in verse 15, he says, Do not let the king impute anything to his servant, or to any of the household of my father, for your servant knows nothing at all of this whole affair. And that's the final thing, that Ahimelech declares his non-involvement in any plot against Saul. He says, I know nothing at all about this whole affair. But of course, in his deranged state, Saul sees this wide-ranging conspiracy in the hospitable act of this one man. And so Saul's punishment is as extreme as ever. Let's continue reading. Verse 16, Saul says, You shall surely die, Ahimelech, you and all your father's household. And the king turned to the guards who were tending him. Turn around and put the priests of the Lord to death, because their hand also was with David, and because they knew that he was fleeing and did not reveal it to me. But the servants of the king were not willing to put forth their hands to attack the priests of the Lord. Then the king said to Doeg, You turn around and attack the priests. And Doeg, the Edomite, turned around and attacked the priests, and he killed that day 85 men who wore the linen ephod. And he struck Nob, the city of the priests, with the edge of the sword, both men and women, children and infants, also oxen, donkeys, and sheep. He struck with the edge of the sword. And we'll stop there for a second. The priests, of course, are guilty in Saul's eyes. They're innocent in reality. But of course, Saul suspects them, and it doesn't matter what defense they give to him, he finds offense in everything that they did. And so they must die. But his servants are apprehensive to kill the priests of God. Don't forget, in other places up to now, we've read where Saul's attendants loved and respected David. Several times we're told of the esteem that they hold for David. They knew him to be devoted to the king's welfare. There was no conspiracy against the king. And so the priests in Saul's attendants' eyes had no reason to die. But of course, Doeg, a non-Israelite, on the other hand, he's happy to oblige. And that day, by his command, by his hand, 85 priests, their families, and even their cattle die that day. Now, elsewhere, we've seen the same kind of mass execution. It comes from the Hebrew word called herem. It's what God does with those things. The term that we've seen before is under the ban, right? Extinction that's carried out against the enemies of God. But the thing is those mass executions were carried out by God's orders. God doesn't give the order here. Saul does. Saul usurps the authority of God, and it is stunning in its arrogance. And while Saul kills these priests for a non-offense, David is, of course, still on the run. But there's one priest who escapes. His name is Abiathar. Or let's read about him. In verse 20, it says, "But one son of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled after David. And Abiathar told David that Saul had killed the priests of the Lord. Then David said to Abiathar, I knew on that day when Doeg the Edomite was there, that he would surely tell Saul, I have brought about the death of every person in your father's household. Stay with me. Do not be afraid, for he who seeks my life seeks your life, for you are safe with me." One lone priest, Ahimelech, the son of Ahimelech, Abiathar, he escapes and he seeks out David. And David feels responsible for the death of Ahimelech's or Abiathar's family. He says, I have brought about the death of everyone in your father's household. Now, David didn't do anything. It's what he didn't do. He saw Doeg there. He apparently knew that he was high up in Saul's power structure, but he apparently now was thinking, wow, I should have done something about it. Maybe I should have killed Doeg. And of course, Doeg goes and he snitches to Saul, and now all of Abiathar's family are dead. But David, in his responsibility, offers safety to Abiathar. David says, stay with me. Do not be afraid, for he who seeks my life seeks your life, for you are safe with me. Now, Saul's brutality at Nob had a result that Saul never could have foreseen. Escaping the massacre, Abiathar, a future high priest at Jerusalem, because that's what he will serve as later on, he had little choice but to join David. And in this way, David gained priestly support in addition to prophetic support from the prophet Gad. And ironically, Abiathar, a descendant of Eli, is going to serve David faithfully throughout not only his fugitive years, but also during David's reign on the throne. But for now, David is officially an outlaw. He's on the run. But he has an army, although a small one. He has a prophet, and he has a priest on his side. But more than all that, David, is on God's side. And of course, that's going to make all the difference for helping David get through these difficult years ahead. Well, thanks for joining us. We're going to continue in our study in 1 Samuel, and we hope to see you next time. God bless you.